Iran remains, and we all know this, one of the most dangerous threats to the United States, not only our interests here around the world, but also to regional stability. And I've got a whole list of things that we can go over here that Iran is responsible for.
What a difference a day makes in U.S. foreign policy towards Iran. 24 hours after the White House said Tehran had been keeping up its side of the nuclear deal, the government turned around and slapped Iranians with new sanctions. The U.S. Treasury Department has blacklisted 18 people and entities for a number of alleged offenses. They include supporting Iran's military, accusing them of trying to develop an illegal weapons program, and harassing U.S. naval vessels. Critics say the sanctions are harsh and is a ploy by Donald Trump, who once promised to rip up the Iranian nuclear deal, then decided not to, and is now trying to save face with his supporters. Well, let's talk more about this with former U.S. Ambassador to Syria and Saudi Arabia, Richard Murphy, who's worked in the region for more than 30 years. He's also the director of the American Iran Council. Sir, thank you very much for joining us. Do you support these new sanctions on Iran?
Well, sanctions are always a weapon of choice when one's government is not prepared to go to a military confrontation. It's a way of exerting pressure on another government. Sometimes they're effective, sometimes they're not. The new sanctions were designed to apply to a number of individuals connected with Iran's Quds force, and to make any transactions involving them illegal under American law. And that is because they were identified as supporting terrorism in various countries.
So this sounds very much to me, given that it was a day after the United States had actually said that Iran is not cheating on the nuclear deal, that it is complying when it comes to the nuclear deal. It sounds as if the Trump administration would have loved to actually reveal that the Iranians were cheating on the deal, but they couldn't find much on them. So just a day later, they decided to sanction them for other stuff. Is that how it's done politically?
Well, yeah, that's a fair interpretation, but do recall that when President Obama was in charge, there was a similar imposition of sanctions virtually the same day as when the agreement on the nuclear issues came into effect. So it's been a constant in American policy to keep pressure on issues which are not connected with the nuclear.
Interesting that if we go back 2 years, when we look at the opposition to the Iranian nuclear deal, on the one hand, you had people saying that Iran wants to develop nuclear weapons and will develop nuclear weapons if this deal goes through. That was the one side of the criticism. There was another side to the criticism which said that if you free up all this money to the Islamic Republic of Iran, $100 billion or so dollars, then they will conduct empire building in the region, and they will start to meddle more and try to impose themselves in the region much, much more. With that in mind, are the sanctions directly connected to the nuclear deal? Because the sanctions seem to be suggesting that this is a slap on the wrist to Iran for what it's doing in the region, and it's not about developing nuclear weapons.
No, I think that's fair. It concerns Iranian activities in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in support of Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza. So it's a whole array of Iranian activities which are being targeted.
As a former ambassador, do you sympathize with the Iranian response when the Foreign Minister Zarif says the sanctions poison the atmosphere and violate the spirit of the nuclear agreement? Because in context, here's a country that was a kind of sworn enemy of the United States for the best part of 40 years. 2 years ago, there's a landmark deal. Things are moving in the right direction. And now the Iranians are saying, what are you doing? You're poisoning the atmosphere. Do you sympathize with that perspective?
I understand their point, but our analysts have looked at this whole array of Iranian activities. No problem with what they've done thus far in observing the nuclear accord, but that their activities are destabilizing in the region. And actually, Foreign Minister Zarif, I think, has gone beyond saying it's against the spirit. He said it's against the letter of the accord that we are opposing business investments in Iran. But these are separate issues.
Ambassador Murphy, are we seeing the region being dictated now by Saudi Arabia? And there's an interpretation saying that because of President Trump's naivety, because he might not have come into it with the same sort of level of depth of knowledge as someone like former President Barack Obama, that the Saudis are playing him, and the Saudis are using the US president to get what they want in the region, whether it's vis-a-vis Iran or even Qatar and that crisis. Is that fair?
Well, that's fair up to a point. Although President Trump, not so far back in time, was very critical of Saudi Arabia as well. He apparently was persuaded during his visit to Riyadh last month that the Saudis were conducting a very strong anti-terror campaign, and that a number of countries agreed in accusing Qatar of supporting international terrorism. That's still being debated, and attempts at mediation have been made. But it's a confused picture, and the president has changed his approach, although consistently anti-terror. He's changed his approach in picking out the particular actors.
Ambassador Richard Murphy, it's been good to talk to you again. Thanks so much for joining us.